Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BCE. Are you all sitting comfortably? I hope so. So you can take a look at these slides too at the Roman history Prezi that I'm going to be updating. It will change a lot, but if you just zoom into 390, you should be able to find it pretty simply. And you can click on this little area and it'll start you into the little slideshow. So we're going to find out about these fellows here and how they conquered or nearly conquered Rome. Allegedly. This is still kind of in the area of legendary history, getting out of it a bit, but we don't want to believe that it happened exactly like this. At any rate, it'll explain why the Romans were so afraid of the Gauls and a couple of interesting etymologies along the way. So, moving on, who the heck are these people? Well, we kind of imagine or used to imagine just people moving in from up here and sort of violently migrating down through here. That's how the Romans tend to see it. And it's just a group of like marauding barbarians who are coming to take over and destroy everything. But it's not quite like that. Like a lot of other population movements in the past, it tends to be framed much more as a violent sort of violent invasion rather than a slower and more gradual, peaceful, and generally just normal population movement. If we just look at who these people are, well, when we talk about the Gauls, we also are talking about the Celts. And who exactly they are is a complicated story. Historians, anthropologists, and whatnot will talk about Latin and Hallstatt peoples. You can see these are two sites here that give their names to sort of cultures, groups of artifacts and practices that people use, that archaeologists use to describe peoples. We don't exactly have their names for them. Those are the names of modern sites where people are found. But kind of like how the Neanderthals are named for the place they were found rather than, that's a pretty Neander-looking dude that you just dug up there, Mr. Archaeologist, Paleontologist. But at any rate, you have these peoples here that all speak more or less what we would call Celtic languages. And the Greeks run into these people, they call them Keltoi. And sometimes the Romans use that word, they adapted into Latin, into Celtai, or they called them this other thing, Galli. And later on, when a group of these people does go marauding way the heck over here into Greece and beyond, those people get called by the Greeks Galatai. So these are, as you can see, also made up of a bunch of different tribes. There are a bunch of different ethnic groups here. And it's not clear that they are just one unified culture, but they have some things in common. And the ancient peoples tend to treat them as a big old group. A group of people that they are also looking at as somewhat barbaric, as others. And so that lets them kind of collapse and simplify who they are, treat them as just this mass of people that are very different and kind of scary. So most of the things we're going to see about them are from the Greek and Roman perspective, and we don't have a lot of their own sort of descriptions of who they are, what they're all about. So it's going to sound a little bit hostile. We just have to use that as the evidence we have. So now, going on to the passage from Livy, where we first start to see this, after the expulsion of that citizen Camillus, this is the guy who has just conquered the city of Veii, Rome's big old enemy across the Tiber River, whose presence, if anything in this life is certain, would have made the capture of Rome impossible. Disaster approached the ill-fated city with the arrival of envoys from the men of Clusium seeking help against the Gauls. If you remember the name Clusium, that's where our friend Lars Porsena is from. Lars Porsena being the king who almost conquered, or maybe actually did conquer Rome after the expulsion of the Tarquins. The story runs that this race, allured by the delicious fruits and especially the wine, then a novel luxury, had crossed the Alps and possessed themselves of the lands that had before been tilled by the Etruscans, and that wine had been imported into Gaul expressly to entice them by Arruns of Clusium, in his anger at the seduction of his wife by Lucumo. This youth, whose guardian he had been, was so powerful that he could not have chastised him without calling in a foreign force. It was he who was said to have guided the Gauls across the Alps and to have suggested the attack on Clusium. Now, I would not deny that Arruns or some other citizen brought the Gauls to Clusium, but that those who besieged Clusium were not the first who had passed the Alps is generally agreed. Indeed, it was 200 years before the attack on Clusium and the first capture of Rome that the Gauls first crossed over into Italy. Neither were the Clusini, the first of the Etruscans with whom they fought, but long before that the Gallic armies had given battle to those who dwelt between the Apennines and the Alps. So you have this rather silly story that a marital dispute, in a sense, turns into one guy trying to have his own city conquered by whatever barbarians he can entice with wine. And this plays into a bunch of different tropes about what barbarians are like. Remember that for Greeks and Romans, bravery or manliness, which is the root of our word virtus, is actually not just about being, a strong and scary aggro, roid ragey looking dude like you see in these pictures here, but it is also about self-control. One thing about self-control, you know how to not go to excess when you get exposed to wine and the rest of that. The Gauls are a people that are unused to it, they are allured by it, and they go to excess. They lack self-control. And this plays out both in their sort of personal characteristics, as seen by the Romans, and how the Romans imagine them and sort of describe them fighting in battle. These guys don't look like they're in a organized line here. They're not fighting with the discipline that a Roman army would have. And that's sort of characteristic of how the Romans see a bunch of different peoples that they will class as barbarians. So these people are attacking this Etruscan city of Clusium, and Clusium wants help from the Romans. So the Romans send some envoys up there, and things are going okay at first. Livy tells us it was a peaceful embassy, had it not been for the violence of the ambassadors, who were more like Gauls than Romans. So when the Romans do something wrong, they're actually behaving more like Gauls. Interesting. To them, when they had made known their mission in the council, the Gauls replied that, although they then heard for the first time the name of Roman, they could yet believe them to be stout-hearted men, since the Clusini had sought their aid in time of danger. And inasmuch as they had chosen to defend their allies by negotiation rather than by sword, they would not, for their own part, spurn the peace which the Romans proposed, if the men of Clusium, who possessed more land than they could till, would surrender to the Gauls, who needed land, a portion of their territory. On no other terms could they consider granting peace. They added that they desired to be answered in the presence of the Romans, and that if land were refused them, it was under the eyes of these same Romans that they meant to fight, that they might be able to tell their friends how greatly the Gauls excelled other men in prowess. So you have a bit of a threat and a boast here. When the Romans asked what conceivable right they had to demand land of its occupants under threat of war, and what business Gauls had in Etruria, they were truculently informed that the newcomers carried their right at the point of a sword, and that all things belonged to the brave. Essentially, might makes right. So angry passions being kindled on both sides, they ran to their weapons and joined battle, and the envoys, impelled by fate, which was even then urging Rome to its doom, took up arms in defiance of the law of nations. So one of the only thing really that counts as international law in the ancient world is you can't kill an ambassador. And so for your ambassadors to start fighting puts the Gauls in the position where they might actually have to kill an ambassador, and that's a pretty bad breach. So they have actually broken the one big law here that they really should follow. Nor could it pass unnoticed when in the very forefront of the Tuscan line, Tuscan meaning Etruscan, there were fighting 3 of the noblest and most valiant of the Roman youth, so conspicuous was the stranger's bravery. Of course. Nay, Quintus Fabius even rode out in the front line, and meeting the Gallic leader as he charged boldly at the very standards of the Etruscans, ran his spear through his side and killed him. As he was engaging in despoiling his man, the Gauls recognized him, and the word passed through the army that it was the Roman envoy. Thereupon they gave over their anger at the Clusini and sounded the retreat, uttering threats against the Romans. Some were for marching at once on Rome, but the older men brought them over to send envoys first to complain of their wrongs and to demand the surrender of the Fabii, in satisfaction for the violation of the law of nations. When the Gallic emissaries had started their mission, according to instructions, the Senate disapproved of the conduct of the Fabii and felt the demands of the barbarians to be just. Even the Senate recognized that the Gauls are saying the right thing. They're acting in a civilized way. But private interest could not suffer them, in the case of men of such exalted station, to decree what they approved. And so, that the blame might not rest with the Senate if a Gallic war should chance to bring disaster, they referred the demands of the Gauls to the people for consideration. And with them, wealth and influence carried so much more weight that the men whose punishment was under discussion were elected consular tribunes for the ensuing year. So they essentially get army commands now. At this, the Gauls were enraged, as they had every right to be, and returned to their people with open threats of war. The tribunes of the soldiers chosen with the 3 Fabii were Quintus Sulpicius Longus, Quintus Servilius for his 4th term, and Publius Cornelius Meliganensis, which is a fun name. So the Gauls descend upon the Romans, and for various reasons, the Romans are basically wiped out here, and a lot of their army scatters and flees. The Romans tend to see this as sort of divine punishment for the things they've done wrong. The Romans run into the Gauls, they're suddenly terrified, they don't know how to deal with these big scary dudes who are probably a little bit taller than them. You'd like to believe that, like in all these drawings, they looked like Guy Fieri. They definitely would grease their hair up a little bit, and, going not entirely clothed at your enemies adds a certain intimidation factor. These Romans look a little bit more regular and nicer in their equipment than they might have, but you can see from this picture, at least, that the battle did not go well. And like in a lot of battles, the most casualties actually happen once a line is broken. So you see that they're chasing them down on horses. Cavalry, particularly early on in historical battles, tends to be for chasing down fleeing people and killing them. And that's, when a lot of the people die. So there's another fun little picture here. This is another artist interpretation of the Battle of the Allia. Here you can see Brennus, who looks a little wizened and perhaps not like the greatest warrior, leading them on, but I like the look of this just for being a bit chaotic. At any rate, the Gauls march on Rome, and the Roman army has scattered, and the Romans are so scared they can't even mount any kind of defense. So, as the Gauls were refreshed by a night's rest after the battle, which had at no point been seriously contested, as they were not now taking the city by assault or storm, their entrance the next day was not marked by any signs of excitement or anger. The Romans have mostly scattered at this point and just left the city undefended. A bunch of the older people who didn't really have any way to get away or just wanted to let other people make it stay around, but most people have fled. Passing the Colline Gate, which was standing open, they came to the Forum and gazed round at the temples at the citadel, by which they mean the Capitoline Hill, which alone wore an appearance of war. They left a small body to guard against any attack from the citadel or capital, whilst they were scattered, and then dispersed in quest of plunder throughout the streets, in which they did not meet a soul. Some poured into a body into all the houses. Others made for the most distant ones, expecting to find them untouched and full of spoils. Appalled by the very desolation of the place, and dreading lest some stratagem should surprise the stragglers, like Akbar, they are alert for traps, they returned to the neighborhood of the Forum in close order. The houses of the plebeians were barricaded, halls of the patricians stood open, but they felt greater hesitation about entering the open houses than those which were closed. They gazed with feelings of real veneration upon the men who were seated in the porticos of their mansions, not only because of the superhuman magnificence of their apparel and their whole bearing and demeanor, but also because of the majestic expression of their countenances, wearing the very aspects of gods. So they stood, gazing at them as if they were statues, till, as it is asserted, one of the patricians, Marcus Papirius, roused by the passion of a Gaul who began to stroke his beard, which in those days was universally worn long, by smiting him on the head with his ivory staff. He was the first to be killed, the others were butchered in their chairs. After the slaughter of the magnates, no living being was thenceforth spared, the houses were rifled and then set on fire. So a bunch of these older distinguished Romans just sit there awaiting their fate, and they just watch. They sit still, and we're supposed to believe that they are just such respectable and eminent people that the Gauls are dumbstruck. They can't process how majestic these Romans are. Clearly, this is an objective account. So at the same time, there are Romans who are holding out on the capital. So they fortify the central hill, the Capitoline Hill, and they try to hold out. And that's why a lot of the older people are staying down here too. They don't want to make people run out of food as they're defending the center. So the Gauls are looting the city, and there are some armed Romans in the center. Meanwhile, a bunch of these Romans have scattered, and they've gone to Veii, where their previous good general, Camillus, is sort of organizing some resistance. he is trying to get the army back together, even though he's been exiled because people were somewhat jealous of him. So, while these proceedings were taking place at Veii, the citadel and capital of Rome were in imminent danger. The Gauls had either noticed the footprints left by messengers from Veii, or themselves had discovered a comparatively easy ascent up the cliff to the temple of Carmentis. Choosing a night when there was a faint glimmer of light, they sent an unarmed man in advance to try the road. Then, handing one another their arms where the path was difficult, and supporting each other or dragging each other up as the ground required, they finally reached the summit. So silent had their movements been that not only were they unnoticed by the sentinels, but they did not even wake the dogs, an animal peculiarly sensitive to nocturnal sounds. But they did not escape the notice of the geese, which were sacred to Juno and had been left untouched in spite of the extremely scanty supply of food. So in this glorious picture here, we see some geese of rather unusual size that are kind of, I don't know what they're doing to this man, to be honest. He seems pretty freaked out, but these geese were sacred and they were in the temple of Juno, so even though they're running short on food, they don't eat them. The geese notice or hear the sound of these Gauls climbing the hill. They freak out and wake people up. This proved the safety of the garrison, for their clamor and noise of the wings aroused Marcus Manlius. Yes, this is a real name. No, it does not mean what it sounds like. There's even later a Gaius Manlius. But that's a different story. The distinguished soldier who had been consul 3 years before. He snatched up his weapons and ran to call the rest to arms. While the rest hung back, he struck the boss of his shield on a Gaul who had gotten a foothold in the summit and knocked him down. He fell on those behind and upset them, and Manlius slew the others who had laid aside their weapons and were clinging to the rocks with their hands. By this time others had joined him, and they began to dislodge the enemy with volleys of stones and javelins, so the whole body fell helplessly down to the bottom. When the uproar had died away, the remainder of the night was given to sleep, as far as was possible under such disturbing circumstances, whilst their peril, though past, still made them anxious. And this here is one of my favorite images of this. You don't find all that many pictures, but this seems to be an ad for some sort of goose extract. Maybe fat? I do not really know. But, why not advertise the animal whose bodily extract you are selling with one of their most famous exploits? I don't know where to get this true extract of goose meat, but if anyone finds it, let me know. Now, this temple is in the background. This is actually the root of our word money. And you'll be surprised, perhaps, to hear where this comes from. A word that you've had early on in Latin, moneo monere, means to warn. And because the geese in the temple of Juno warned people, they called the temple that of Juno Moneta, Juno the warner. But something else happened in this temple too, is where coins were generally minted. And so the word moneta gets transferred. Things from the temple of Juno Moneta begins to refer to the things made there, where they're striking coins. And so moneta begins to refer to the money itself, not just the temple. So we owe our word money to some insomniac geese. At this point, there is some Roman military discipline. The soldiers were summoned by the sound of a trumpet to a council in the presence of the tribunes, when the due rewards for good conduct and bad would be awarded. Manlius was commended for his bravery and rewarded not by the tribunes alone, but by the soldiers as a body, for every man brought him at his quarters, which were then at the citadel, a half pound of meal and a quarter of a pint of wine. This does not sound much, but the scarcity made it an overwhelming proof of their affection for him, since each stinted himself of food and contributed in honor of that one man what had to be taken from the necessities of his life. Next, the sentinels who had been on duty at the spot where the enemy had climbed up without their noticing it were called forward. Quintus Sulpicius, the consular tribune, declared that he should punish them all by martial law. He was, however, deterred from this course by the shouts of the soldiers, who all agreed in throwing the blame upon one man. All right. As there was no doubt of his guilt, he was, amidst general approval, flung from the top of the cliff. Seems fitting, I guess. Then, eventually, the Romans have to give up, though. They're being starved out. So, at last, not only food, but hope failed them. Whenever the sentinels were on duty, their feeble frames, almost crushed by the weight of their armor, The army insisted that they should either surrender or purchase their ransom on the best terms they could, for the Gauls were throwing out unmistakable hints that they could be induced to abandon the siege for a moderate consideration. Meeting of the Senate was now held, and the consular tribunes were empowered to make terms. Conference took place between Quintus Sulpicius, the consular tribune, and Brennus, the Gaulish chieftain, and an agreement was arrived at by which £1,000 or so of gold was fixed as the ransom of a people destined ere long to rule the world. Livy has to remind you of Rome's great destiny, though as a good Roman reading this, you would hopefully know it at this point. This humiliation was great enough, but it was aggravated by the despicable meanness of the Gauls, who produced unjust weights. And when the tribune protested, the insolent Gaul threw a sword into the scale with an exclamation intolerable to Roman ears. Vae victis, woe to the vanquished. And here you see a rather salty-looking Gaul adding his sword to the giant weight here. But luckily, the Romans are going to be saved, because while all this has been going on, our buddy, Marcus Furius Camillus, has reunited the scattered Roman army and rushes in to save the day. And so the Romans, they kind of ransom their city, but they kind of don't. You get the sense from these two conflicting versions that they weren't entirely comfortable with however this went down, and there are probably different things happening here that don't quite fit or line up. So that's where we're going to end for now. But remember our buddy Marcus Manlius, who gets the name Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, Marcus Manlius of the Capitoline Hill, because he saved it, along with those geese. Because things are going to go rather strangely for him, and he's going to have another run-in with the Capitoline Hill that's not going to go so well.